Western media always uses three words to describe China's investments in Africa: debt trap diplomacy. We've been told China's real ambitions in Africa are to enslave countries in debt by offering unrealistic loan terms, and when poor African nations can't repay their debts, the Chinese government comes in, seizes their assets, and expands the Chinese empire. This is what we've heard from Western media, but the most important voice to listen to in this discussion is the people of Africa. What is the truth about China's efforts in Africa, and does debt trap diplomacy really exist? Let's answer both of those questions in today's video. Everyone, today's video is all about investing, and I'm going to show you exactly how both the United States and China have been investing into Africa. In March 2018, US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson traveled to Ethiopia to give an important speech on the future of US relations in Africa. Instead of focusing on what the US would do for the continent, Tillerson's primary focus was talking about China. He claimed that China would endanger Africa's long-term political stability. But the message wasn't received well in Africa for one simple reason: irony. You see, the airport that Rex Tillerson flew into was built by China. The road that brought Rex Tillerson from the airport into the city was built by China. Even the very building that Rex Tillerson gave that speech was built by China. Despite these glaring examples of successful projects with China, Rex only wanted to talk about why Africa shouldn't be doing business with China. It's a very difficult message to sell when China is making a real difference in the quality of life for African people. To understand why China has overtaken the US as the largest foreign direct investor in Africa, it's important to understand the different types of loan the US and China are offering. Loans from China are invested into modern infrastructure. And when you build airports, roads, railways, hospitals, power grids, and schools, all of these assets go directly into improving the productivity of a nation. It's an investment into giving the future generation a chance at a better life. And it's also a smart loan strategy from China. When you are investing in something that improves productivity, you most certainly are increasing the chances of being paid back on that debt. On the flip side, loans that are offered from America are typically given in emergency situations to cover trade and fiscal deficits. While these Western loans are certainly needed and provide a short-term solution to a complex problem, the money is spent immediately. It doesn't resolve the core issue, and it most definitely won't prevent it from happening again. Much of Africa's infrastructure was inherited from the colonial era, but the lack of modern roads, power networks, clean water, modern schools, all of this has hampered Africa's economic development for years. A study by the UK government-sponsored Commission for Africa estimated that transportation bottlenecks and inefficiencies amount to an 80% export tax on Ugandan textiles. Without better electricity and clean water, how can these factories in Uganda produce quality products? Without roads and ports, how can these Uganda factories ship their products around the world? Without basic infrastructure, it's now more difficult to attract investment into the sector, and ultimately, all of these challenges will hinder job creation. It's very easy to see why closing this infrastructure gap is the biggest priority for the future of Africa. For decades, weak planning, poor leadership, corruption, and a lack of regional cooperation amongst African countries hindered the continent's ability to improve. However, things changed when China integrated many African nations into the Belt and Road Initiative. From 2000 to 2020, China has helped African countries build more than 13,000 kilometers of roads and railway, 80 large-scale power facilities, 130 medical facilities, 45 sport venues, and over 200 schools. It was a big moment in Kenya's history when passengers boarded the Madaraka Express, which connects Kenya's capital and its main port of Mombasa. At a cost of $3.6 billion, this rail line represents the most expensive infrastructure project in Kenya's history. It was built by the China Road and Bridge Corporation, who hired over 25,000 Kenyan workers to work on the railway. Another win for Kenya. The rail line exceeded expectations and passed 2 million passengers in the first 17 months of operation, prompting Kenya's Daily Nation newspaper to write, "China is a worthy partner in its efforts to break the age-old poverty trap based on centuries of underdevelopment." A recent survey conducted by the Afro barometer of 34 African countries from 2019 to 2020 found that while some were concerned about being heavily indebted to China, 63% of Africans view China as a positive external influence on the continent. This compares to 60% for the United States and 57% for the United Nations. But honestly, we can't discuss China's efforts in Africa without bringing in a true expert on the situation. And I would like everybody to meet Deborah Braudegam, the author of The Dragon's Gift, The Real Story of China in Africa. Deborah and her colleague wrote this article for The Atlantic entitled "The Chinese Debt Trap is a Myth," claiming that the narrative wrongfully portrays both Beijing and the developing countries it deals with. In this article, Deborah goes on to state, "Our research shows that Chinese banks are willing to restructure the terms of existing loans and have never actually seized an asset from any country." The myth of debt trap diplomacy has been popularized by many Western politicians in an effort to combat the rise of China. Over the past 20 years, Chinese construction firms have learned a lot from their American and European counterparts. China now boasts 27 firms among the top 100 global contractors, up from just 9 in 2000. In contrast, the United States has only 7 contractors among the global top 100, down from 19 in 2000. This represents a 63% decline for America in just 2 decades. Over the past few weeks, I've made multiple videos on China's investments around the world. I've talked about China's efforts in Asia Pacific, Latin America, even China's efforts around the world. But it's important to highlight the truth of what China is doing in Africa. In the future, the country that offers loans for developing infrastructure is going to be the leader of the developing world. And one can argue that China is in a better position to deal with these smaller developing nations, because just 4 decades ago, China's economy was also small and just starting to develop. China can empathize with these countries' current position and can provide them the exact same playbook that helped China rise to become a global leader in the world.